Dan, Mr. Rayfield, how are you?
What's going on?
I appreciate you taking out the time to come in, man. I got a couple of hot button topics I would like to discuss with you, and we'll get you in and out.
Not a problem.
Obviously,
I know we tried to do this a couple times before, and we got all mixed up in the time. So I'm glad we could get it squared away. I'm happy to join you guys.
nah, I appreciate it, appreciate it. So I want to start with just your overall thoughts on the huge event that is Crawford and Earl Spence, and your thoughts on that.
Listen, it was a great event. What can you say? That was as good as it gets in our sport. It was two of the great fighters of our time doing battle, and although it did not turn out to be a great fight like we all hoped, super competitive with ebbs and flows and back and forth, which would be better than if it was just a boring fight that didn't have any kind of drama or any kind of interesting stuff happen. But Terrence Crawford showed himself to be the Hall of Famer that I think a lot of us already sort of figured he was even before that fight. And in my opinion, anyway, takes the mantle as the number one pound for pound fighter in boxing.
So obviously, we're very greedy as boxing fans. Once the fight is done, we want
Yeah.
to know what's next. And there seems to be a lot of options, but Terrence doesn't seem to be open to many of those. He seems to be stuck on Charlo and the Earl Spence rematch. What do you see happening?
Well, I'm not sure what the other huge options are for him at the moment. Obviously, he doesn't have a choice in the matter if Errol exercises his right to the contractual rematch. So that's kind of out of his hands. If Errol accepts, says I'm doing the rematch and submits the formal paperwork or lets them know contractually, then that will be Terrence Crawford's next fight. So he's got to sit and wait for that. I believe that he had it was either, I forget if it was 30 days or 45 days, but the point is it's coming soon that there'll be a decision made as far as that goes. So if it's going to be the Errol Spence rematch, that'll be the next fight. If it's not going to be the Errol Spence rematch, and Crawford wants to fight again before the end of this year, which he may not necessarily want to do. He just made a huge amount of money. It's not like it's incumbent on him to get back in the ring. I mean, as fans, we'd love to see him follow up that kind of brilliant performance and not go inactive again. Uh, but remember, he did fight earlier this year. This was his second fight by today's boxing star standards. Two fights is normal. So if he doesn't fight the rest of the year, it wouldn't be completely out of the realm. But there's still plenty of time if he does want to fight again to get something else going. Either the rematch with Spence if Errol wants it. And if it's not, look, he's not going to fight Charlo next. That would obviously be the obvious fight because it's a totally normal thing in boxing history for the champion in the welterweight division to then go to the junior middleweight division and fight the champion in that weight class, and that's Charlo. And Charlo has said to anybody who will listen that after he takes care of whatever happens on September 30th with Canelo, win or lose, he says he's coming back to defend his titles at 154. So that's a hugely entertaining, interesting fight that a lot of people I think would be very excited about if the two undisputed champions were to fight each other. Although obviously once the fight between Charlo and Canelo takes place, win or lose, Charlo he'll still be champion, but he won't be undisputed from the fact that he has all the belts because of the machinations of the sanctioning bodies and they've got mandatories. But it's okay, put that aside. It's still a great matchup. Um, so if Spence says he doesn't want the rematch, and you know that you have a fight on September 30th where Charlo is occupied, the question becomes what is the other big fight out there for Crawford if it's not either of those two guys? I don't think I know the answer to that. I mean, he could look. He's got now. I think was a pleasant situation that worked well for him in dealing with PBC. Um, I'm not sure if they still have him for another fight if Errol turns down the rematch. If they do, or even if they don't and they make another deal, look, they still have other quality fighters. I mean, Keith Thurman's going to want to come back. He was there at the fight talking it up about how he wants to get back in the ring. I think that's a possibility. But you tell me, I mean, what else is out there that's like would be a big fight for him? I'm not sure. The guys at 140 pounds are not yet coming to 147. He's not going to be fighting, say, Teofimo Lopez or Devin Haney, Regis Prograis. Those fights aren't happening at this stage of the game. So I'm really not sure what the big fight is for him at this moment.
Ooh, I don't really want to give it to you because then we're gonna spiral. I had these hot button topics not to keep you here so long, but Lord, I
You
assume.
listen. You can keep me if you want. I'm good.
All right, great. I assume Tim Tszyu, right? Like you said, once Jermell Charlo steps in the ring, the bell rings. He loses his title. Tim Tszyu somewhere in Australia celebrating that he got elevated. Crawford could fight Tim Tszyu. I spoke to his team, Bomac. Well, Danny spoke to his team, my co-host, and they said they will not be going to Australia for that. So I don't know. Can we get Tszyu to come back here to America for a
Well,
Crawford fight?
I think absolutely. Tim Tszyu, first of all, that is a good matchup. Second of all, I think that Tim Tszyu and his people would have absolutely no problem to come back to America. They want to fight in America. Obviously, he does big business in Australia, but he came here with a purpose when he fought on Showtime. He was signed to come back here to fight Charlo when the fight was postponed in January for a fight of the magnitude of a Terrence Crawford, which would obviously be a big time Las Vegas fight. I guarantee you they would be happy to come back and fight in the United States. You can't make that fight in terms of what the financials are for both sides. If it's in Australia, the time zones don't really adjust very well. And even if you could work it out, like they've done that before, where the fight's during the day and it's at night here in America. But the money for a Crawford fight at that level, you need to be here in the United States so fans realize it's happening and the media is able to better cover it. I mean, there'd be no way that fight would happen in Australia unless there was some kind of crazy pot of gold that somebody decided to put up for it. So I think that if Tim Tszyu and that fight could, if Crawford had interest in that matchup, 100% that the Tszyu team would be willing and ready and able to fight in the United States. If they were willing to fight here against Charlo in Las Vegas, I have no doubt they would do it against Terrence Crawford.
I mean, and just to tie that up, like if he really wants to be the first, and for Al, if Al wants to go in history as the guy to have the first ever 3-time undisputed, someone has to get the belt from Tszyu when Charlo wins or loses to Canelo to then make that a true undisputed fight. But my other big fight, obviously, you mentioned Keith Thurman, based off pay-per-view numbers and his, the way he speaks. I think he can sell some units with Crawford. It'll give Crawford, another December fight that's a la tune-up-ish just because Keith has been out of the ring so long. We can't really say he's in his prime or at
Right.
his best.
That said, though, I would never look. I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying about the time off. I would not refer to a fighter the caliber of Keith Thurman, even with the time off and all, as a tune-up fight. It's still he's not like a second-rate kind of guy. He's a real solid quality fighter. Now, maybe he's not what he once was, but I personally would not refer to a fight with Keith Thurman as a tune-up.
I'm glad that you say that because that means that the time off doesn't come into consideration and you're looking at solely skill. So my other super fight, and I call it that, and it's going to sound crazy. You're older than me. You've been in this business longer. You can make a better comparison. I've been trying to do this now for about 5-6 straight days with dozens of callers every single day. But I think Tank can be this version's Duran. He can move up and fight our version of Ray Leonard and Crawford, but not really Crawford because Crawford's more a haggler, right? Except he's getting the Ray Leonard treatment in the end. He doesn't have the losses of Hagler. Long story short, Duran was the greatest lightweight, moves up 2 divisions to fight Ray Leonard and beats him undefeated. Is it possible here?
Listen, I'm not one to knock somebody's fantasy fight. That's certainly would be public interest. I have to imagine, and I have nothing against Tank Davis, the boxer, whatsoever. He's an exciting fighter. He's a personality. He can punch like anybody. But I could not, in good conscience, put his name in the same sentence in my mouth with Roberto Duran. That is not happening. He has yet to fight the top fighters, even at 135 pounds, much less 140 pounds, much less 147 pounds. And you're talking about going from essentially 135. He's had one fight at 140. And then, of course, the Garcia fight was 136, basically a lightweight fight. And I'd like to see some evidence that he can handle even a top fighter at 140. You want to go fight, pick a guy. You want to fight Teofimo and beat him. You want to do a top guy at lightweight or somewhere in the middle like a Haney or Lomachenko or whoever before you start mixing up with Crawford. Because if he's going to fight Crawford or if he's going to welterweight, you're not just going to go there. You're not talking about him fighting just a regular, quality welterweight. You talk about him fighting the best welterweight in Crawford,
But Dan,
the fighter that many people think is number 1 in the world.
how again, we have to take away how they brought Tank up and just solely look at his skill and what he's done with the people in front of him. How
Hmm.
much different or better is he than Mikey? Mikey had an opportunity with Earl. Mikey moved up the same amount of divisions. Mikey doesn't have the power or the explosiveness of Tank. Remember the Gamboa fight? He gave Crawford problems for being shorter. Crawford admitted that in an interview. Gamboa, Tank is short and stocky. He can stay under those uppercuts. He's proved in other fights that he's deadly with. Obviously, the power has to translate, and that's the
Yep.
only reason that I use Duran, not because of Tank's accomplishments, just to show casuals, hey, there was a lightweight that moved up 2 divisions to face a very great welterweight in Ray Leonard and accomplished that. He even went 15 with Hagler at
I mean, look, I
60.
mean, it wasn't that long ago. I mean, it wasn't in the next fight, but it was by design. When Shane Mosley was the lightweight champion, he took two smaller welterweight fights just to sort of get used to. He skipped over junior welterweight, went to welterweight, took the two lesser fights, and then it was all by design to fight Oscar De La Hoya for the welterweight title. And we saw what he did, and he eventually became a champion also at a junior middleweight. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying that when you're dealing with the number one fighter in boxing, and Tank is not yet even proven in his own weight class against the very best. And I'm not saying that as a negative about Tank Davis, because I think he would probably do very well against some of those guys. He does not, for whatever the reasons are, his decisions or his advisors or whoever, they haven't looked to make those matchups. Um, but that would be fine. And you mentioned about Mikey Garcia when he fought Errol Spence. I mean, we all thought Mikey was kind of taking off a little bit more than he could chew on that fight. I didn't really give him much of a chance in that fight against Errol. Now, I didn't expect Spence to win like literally 12 rounds to 0. I thought he would win the fight probably by a knockout, in the middle to later rounds. But instead, he just kind of played with him for 12 rounds and toyed with him and won every single second. So, Mikey was never cut out to be a welterweight. He was a tremendous fighter, from featherweight to junior welterweight, I guess. But once he got above that, there was really no competing even with the best guys. And as far as Tank going to welterweight, I'll just reiterate: if he wants to do that, I'd be perfectly happy with it. But I would personally like to see him have at least one fight against one of the better guys, in and around that division. Either 40, even a top fighter at 35, like a truly top fighter, or even somebody else that's not Crawford at 47, instead of throwing him in with the number one fighter in the sport, and is who's now, doesn't he may be 35 years old, Terrence Crawford, but there's nobody that could tell me that he doesn't look like he's still in his absolute prime right now.
2 follow-ups on the subject. So, would you be different on this subject if the fight with Earl hadn't happened yet?
Well, I mean, I guess you probably would be because you wouldn't have known what's going to happen. But you can't really go backwards. We saw what happened. We know, how he took him apart. Now, I've always thought Crawford was a top fighter. And I never blamed Crawford for the inability to get the biggest fights. It was just disappointing that he didn't have the biggest fights in the division, because for the last several years since he got there, with the first fight he had in the weight class against Jeff Horn, he won the belt, the WBO belt. That was really, in my opinion, was fraudulently had been owned by Horn, because I thought he got beaten by Manny Pacquiao. But put that aside for a second. He didn't get the chance to fight Danny Garcia. He didn't get the chance to fight Keith. He didn't get the chance to fight Errol years earlier. He didn't get the chance to fight Sean Porter when he was still at his best. He didn't get a chance to fight even like a Lamont Peterson when he was still really good. All those PBC welterweights he missed out on, and he finally was able to get Porter, which turned out to be his last fight. And then he obviously got Errol when Errol was, still considered one of the best out there. Uh, so we don't know what would have happened back in that day. But you can't look backwards. I mean, he did fight Errol Spence, and now we're talking about, you're saying about the possibility of a Tank fight. So I can only base it on what I saw that took place 2 weeks ago.
For sure, for sure. So I guess the other one is Jerome Boots Ennis, where he doesn't have the main events that a Keith One Time Thurman has. He hasn't been on pay-per-view like Thurman. But if we're going in a social media era where Steven Espinoza cares a lot about that when it came to the Tank and Ryan fight,
Mm-hmm.
he is more popular on social media and has more followers than Thurman. Um, can you see Terrence sticking around welterweight for that fight, and do you see Showtime, putting up enough to make that fight? Is it worth it to anybody?
Well, as far as if they would put up the money, that would be a Crawford is now to the point where his next fights are going to be on pay per view. So it's not a matter of anybody putting up the money. You go out there, you basically you eat what you kill. Essentially, you sell it and you reap the reward on what the pay per view does. So maybe there's some kind of guarantee, but it's not going to be some kind of crazy, huge, massive number. You got to do it. You're going to get paid on what you sell, which is what Errol and Terrence were able to do because of the fact they did a great number on pay per view. Not to mention that the gate was over $20 million, and then you take all the other revenue, from the international broadcast to the sponsorships that you saw on the ring mats and on the ring apron and all that business. Then you throw in like all the T-shirts. I was staying at the Park MGM, and they sold out all the programs and they sold out all the posters, and all those guys, they get a piece of that action. So there's money to be made. The question to me is, does Terrence Crawford, is he going to be motivated for those kinds of fights? If he wants to stay at welterweight and defend the titles, the undisputed titles, then he could fight a Boots Ennis, but who's an IBF mandatory. The next in line in terms of the mandatories is another fight that would probably be a good fun fight, which is Amanta Stanionis, who's a WBA mandatory. That's the fight that's next on the docket. Because when you're undisputed and you have a bunch of belts, the organizations use the rotation system. So even though it may have been a while since one of the particular belts was defended in terms of a mandatory, they agree on what the order of those mandatories is supposed to be. And next up in the welterweight rotation is Stanionis. And I believe after Stanionis would be Ennis. So it's going to be up to Crawford. If Errol Spence does not accept the terms and want to do the rematch and says, you know what, I've decided against taking that option, and Crawford wants to still have the belts, it's going to come, the rubber will hit the road because the WBA will order the fight and they'll have a certain amount of time to make a deal, or there'll be a purse bid. And that'll be that. And I mean, certainly he could vacate the belt or and go in whatever direction he wants. I don't think at this stage of Crawford's career, anybody's going to push him to do a fight that he doesn't want. It's sort of the same thing. Like, no one's going to push Canelo to do a fight he's not interested in, or Tyson Fury, or, the biggest guys out there. They do mandatories when they fit the agenda. Canelo Alvarez did the Yildirim mandatory in the WBC because it fit the agenda. It was perfectly fine. He was staying active. He was fighting 4 times in 11 months. It was part of a deal to get the Callum Smith fight. So he said, fine, I'll slip one in there against kind of a soft touch and take care of the mandatory. I don't think Crawford is looking to do those types of fights. And I'm not sitting here saying that a fight with Stanionis or Spence, rather Stanionis or Ennis, are soft touches. It's just a matter of, after having that level of an event, how much backwards does Crawford want to go? Because listen, nothing against either of those fighters. Going from fighting Errol Spence in the biggest fight of our time to taking a fight with Stanionis or even a Boots Ennis is still a step down in terms of not the competition, but in terms of the magnitude of the event.
I got to double back because it slipped up. So I listened to your podcast, the betting one, and I'm obviously subscribed.
Good.
So
Bet US, baby.
So I'm doubling back on the Tank situation to make sure you know that he said he could knock out Crawford in 6. Also, remember the back and forth with Ellerby, Tank, and Thurman, how they felt they could also beat Thurman. Plus, he fought Barrios, who moved up to welterweight, fought Thurman, didn't get stopped by Thurman, then next fight knocked out a welterweight. Recently, this week, Crawford did a bunch of interviews, and in one, I think it was a Hot 97 with Ebro, he said Tank would have to come up to welterweight. So again, guys like you, maybe with the magical pen, maybe we can entice Crawford to possibly giving up a pound for a super fight, right? Because technically speaking, Dan, give me another super fight for Crawford.
Listen, I'm not into catch weights. If the athletes agree to it, I'd have no problem with it. But I'm not going to pound for a catch weight fight. If Terrence Crawford is the undisputed, number 1, undefeated welterweight champ of the world, pound for pound number 1 in the sport, and you've got a great star who's also undefeated and a fine fighter in his own right, in Gervonta Davis, and he wants to take the challenge, go to 147 and fight the guy, and stop none of the nonsense of catch weights. What's 1 pound going to be? Terrence Crawford has earned his right to say, you want to fight me? Fight me at 147 the same way. We can go through a litany of other top fighters. No one's going to make Canelo Alvarez change weight, to give him a pound or give him 2 pounds or whatever. You could say the same thing when Tank Davis is fighting in the weight class that he's comfortable in. He's not giving up any weight. He made Ryan come all the way down to 36 when Ryan would have been much better off probably staying higher. He made him do a rehydration clause. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So in a fight between Crawford and Tank, if it was to happen, Crawford is the one that can dictate a lot of that, because as big of a star as Tank is, he's got one big mega fight that he did with Ryan, and I'm not downgrading the event. It was a huge event, and it did bigger business than Spence and Crawford. But you can't deny that Crawford's got a certain level of accomplishment and also commercial ability now, also based on what happened with Spence. And he's the champ, and he's also the undefeated guy. He's also the pound-for-pound guy. If they want to do the fight, I would see no reason why Crawford would even
Whoa,
acknowledge
Dan,
going down 1 pound.
are you
Not even
saying,
1 pound, not even 1 ounce.
but wait, are you saying Crawford's the A side?
Damn right.
Wow, there's no way. Listen, Tank's consistency on pay-per-view supersedes Crawford's. Like, Crawford's not been successful till last week.
Listen, I'm not in any way knocking what Tank has done on pay-per-view at all, not whatsoever. He has one mega fight. Can't argue with that. Biggest fight of this year. I've, all along going into the Errol Spence and Crawford fight week, I was asked by many people on some interviews, on some YouTube channels, that sort of thing about the fight. And I kept saying Spence and Crawford is not the biggest fight of the year, because when I use the word biggest, for me anyway, it means biggest in terms of everything, and that includes the commercial aspect of the fight. And I knew, as great of a matchup as it was heading into it, how big of a deal it was, what I kept terming Spence and Crawford was, it's the most important fight of the year. It's the most significant fight of the year. It's the most historical fight of the year. But it wasn't the biggest fight of the year. I always believed.
It was the better fight.
Yeah, it was the more,
because we knew what we were getting with Ryan and Tank. There were a certain demographic that believed in Ryan.
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, what did it mean for the history of the sport? I'm a historian by heart, so to me, the undisputed championship, the two number 1 and 2 guys, or 3 or however, but clearly Errol and Crawford were, even on the worst day, in the top 5, both of them in pound for pound. Both were unbeaten. But the title was a big deal. So I'm thinking about it from the historical point of view. Had nothing to do with, because, you bring in a certain audience, or the other guy brings in a certain audience. I just knew that Spence Crawford, as great of a matchup as it was not going to do the same kind of business as what Ryan and Tank did. However, that's one fight. Now, Tank has done good business on his other fights, but he's not done crazy numbers. He's done very solid numbers. I can't argue with that. But 300,000-ish is not a million. And again, you're right. Crawford has not performed on pay-per-view, but he hasn't really had that many fights. The Porter fight, I don't even blame Porter or Crawford. That was just a complete dumb business decision, in my opinion, for having ESPN do it only on ESPN Plus. They tried to make it they do their UFC fights, when boxing consumers have been conditioned for 30 years that you can just buy it on regular television. And when they finally flipped the switch and they made that fight only available on ESPN Plus, where first you had to buy the subscription, then you had to buy the pay-per-view, it limited the audience so severely. I mean, I was at that fight at Mandalay Bay, and I was getting people who, even boxing people who I know in the business, were texting me how come I can't buy the fight on pay-per-view? Or I was getting people on Twitter how come I can't find the fight? And I had to explain to them, well, you have to go first buy ESPN Plus, then you got to buy the pay-per-view. And people just had no idea. So that fight bombed in one sense, but it really wasn't because it wasn't an attractive fight. It wasn't an attractive fight. It was because they just completely mismanaged the way that they made it available. You got to go back before that. Nobody expected Crawford Avanesian to do any kind of numbers with BLK Prime, that really had no idea what they were doing. And before that, he wasn't a big name. He was, he had a couple of smaller fights against Khan and against Victor Postol years ago. So he's still sort of a neophyte when it comes to headlining pay-per-views. I dare say that if he's fighting a real top guy, he's going to do big numbers also. He could do on the level of the non-mega fights that Gervonta did. If you put Crawford in, coming off that performance against another solid opponent,
Boots.
maybe he may not do a million buys, but I think he could do the same kind of numbers that Tank did and hit those 300s.
With Boots?
I think that would have a chance. I think if you put him in with any of the guys, whether you put him in with Boots or maybe Stanionis, or if you did a Thurman type of fight, I think those are fights that would have a chance to do some commercial success. Absolutely.
All right, I'm gonna leave my
You're
fantasy
saying
alone.
you're saying that Davis is the big star on pay-per-view because he just has the longer track record, which he does, having been in more events, but he's only got one event that's a home run.
Absolutely, but those other ones, they're either at least doubles or he's getting on base. They're able to cover overhead, cover his
Sure.
purse, and then he does great gates, so
Oh,
it
no doubt
makes
about it.
sense.
Listen, I'm not. I'm like I've said many times. I'm not knocking what he's done. I'm just making it. I'm making the only point that is that the fact that he'd be going into the other guy's weight class, that he's the champ, he's number one pound for pound, he's coming off his own very successful event, that that they're going to share stature, and that Crawford, at least in terms of weight, is going to probably dictate. And by the way, I've been doing this a long time. I got almost 25 years in this. I never really gave a damn about A side, B side.
Mm.
You want to fight the fight, fight the fight. But I don't care whose name comes first. I don't care who walks to the ring first. I don't care who gets announced first. To me, if I was the fighter, the only thing I would give a shit about was whose name do they say last at the end of the fight when they raise your hand.
Mm. So back to regular boxing, no more fantasy. I would like you to now compare Terrence Crawford as the undisputed champion, Boots Ennis as the mandatory, to Devin as the undisputed champion, Shakur as the mandatory, and your stance on the 25%. Is it fair to have 25% of undisputed? Because the way I see it, he's getting a shot at all five belts, Lenio included. Because if you beat Devin, you're the man, so the ring comes with it, plus every other belt. If you don't take the 25%, Devin becomes champion in recess. You get a shot at one belt.
Yeah, true. That's true. Listen, to me, the organizations have their way they do the splits of the paper of fights in a purse bid situation. No one is saying, and this was the same thing that happened going back a few months ago when there was a lot of back and forth about whether or not we would see like Jose Ramirez fight Regis Prograis, for example, or that type of fight. Those deals are only, that was when the title Regis had won the belt, or even when it was vacant. The percentage split that is dictated, that's only if there's a purse bid. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's
Mm-hmm.
nothing that would make it so that whatever two fighters you want to mention, if it's Haney and Shakur, there's nothing that would stop their sides from sitting down and negotiating a deal that would be whatever percentage they agreed on. So the percentage split, and in the WBC, I believe it would be 70-30 in favor of the champion. And then they take 10% and they put, whatever the winning bid is, if there is a purse bid, they take 10% as a bonus and they give it to the winner of the fight. In fact, we just saw that literally as we're doing this earlier on Tuesday. They had the WBC had the purse bid for Oshaki Foster against Rocky Hernandez for the WBC's 130-pound title, and Matchroom Boxing won the purse bid for like $466,000 and change. 10%, 46,000 and change, sits in a escrow account, and they split the other 90%, 70-30, and the winner of the fight gets the other 46,000 and change as a bonus. So, but if you don't do a purse bid, just sit down like business people at a table and work out what it is, whatever the percentage is. I mean, people get hung up on percentages. I know this. You can't pay your light bill with a percentage. You can't pay your mortgage with a percentage. You can't send your kid to college with a percentage. You need cash. You need money. And, the champion in this case, Devin Haney, I think, of course, would be entitled to the larger piece of the pie in that fight. My opinion. He's done a solid number on pay-per-view already with Lomachenko, and they did obviously a very good gate there. And Shakur Stevenson has not had that opportunity yet. I'm not saying that down the road he can't become a pay-per-view top fighter in his own right. And also, sometimes if you want to get the opportunity, you got to give to get. So you have to decide, is it worth it for me to give up some on this fight, especially a guy like Shakur or Haney, because they're still young fighters. They're still in their early to mid 20s. They got plenty of time, you would think. We're not talking about a guy that's maybe in his last couple of fights, and it's imperative to get every dollar there is to make sure you have a nice retirement fund. You got to figure these young guys have plenty of years to make huge amounts of money. So it's a calculated risk. If you really think you're going to win this fight, I'm not saying, get taken advantage of, but, take the short money, go out there and kick some ass.
Do you feel Devin took short money by taking the deal to sign the Lou DiBella plus co-promote with Top Rank and the 3-fight deal that he took? Would you recommend fighters to take that sort of deal?
I mean, from my knowledge, Devin Haney made a career money for those fights he had with those guys under those fights, under that promotion. So I think he did very well. He made I don't know, I think it was like $4 million well, a little less for the first fight, but like 4 million and change for the second Kambosos fight, and then did very, very well in the Loma fight. So I mean, yeah, no, he did very well. I don't think he was taken advantage of financially whatsoever. He made a very smart decision to take that deal. He was a free agent at that time. He had a great opportunity to win the undisputed title, which is a legacy making thing. And I understand this is a business and you want to make money, but I believe that many fighters, besides the money, they want the glory and they want the history and they want that Hall of Fame resume line and all that stuff also. And Devin Haney got it and he made a ton of money doing it. So yeah, it was a good deal for him. And
But
if
it
you
was
could
a
get that deal,
sacrifice, yes or no? Because that's what I'm trying. I feel
what was
like,
the sacrifice?
I mean, he had to sign to two promoters to get one fight. Plus, there was a rematch clause. Both of them were in Australia. And then after you lift the belts from the champ, you're forced to fight Lomachenko.
Well, he wasn't forced to fight anybody. Lomachenko
It
was
was
his
part of the
WBC.
contract.
That wasn't part of the contract. That was a
Court,
mandatory fight.
According to Bill, they couldn't fight anybody besides Lomachenko.
I don't know if I believe that necessarily. Maybe they couldn't have done it under that promotional contract, and they would have had to, give up the belt or something like that. But the point here is, though, he made a lot of money for those fights. It was a great deal for Devin Haney, who had made good money with Matchroom Boxing in his previous, handful of fights that helped get him a belt and put on some events. They did a good job with him also, but he had the opportunity to make this money. He raised his hand when Loma dropped out of the Kambosos fight. Devin said, "I'll take that smoke," and he made the fight. And sometimes you got to go to Australia. Kambosos was a big draw there. They sold out a huge stadium in Australia. If they had done that fight in the United States, it would have drawn a few thousand people. So, you fish where the fish are, and the money and the people were in Australia for those fights. He went, he did the job, and he did a brilliant performance. I'm a huge Devin Haney fan. I thought he looked great in both fights. And he comes back as champ. Again, nobody's entitled to have a fight in their backyard. No one's entitled to make huge amounts of money. You got to earn it. Kambosos was able to, you get what you negotiate is the bottom line. They negotiated a good deal. Haney got the opportunity. It paid off for everybody because they both made a ton of money. And in Haney's case, he got the chance to win the titles all in one night. And, I don't love the rematch clause. I'm on record, not just for that fight, for any of these fights. I don't love that Errol has a rematch clause because, if he exercises it, I don't think the fight's going to do anything close to that. Nobody will be as excited. But for Haney, what else could he have gotten? He got as much money as there possibly could have been made in these last couple of fights. And is there some other promoter that would have done a better job in making a big event or paying him as much money as Top Rank and Lou did for the two fights that he just finished off with the rematch and then the Loma fight? No, I don't think so.
And how do you compare Shakur to Boots? Is there a comparison there? Obviously, again, Shakur has more of a fandom, so people are like, oh, the 25% is disrespectful. I feel like it's 25% of all the belts. It's a great offer. Is Boots in the same situation? Should he be entitled to more than 25% if Crawford offers the fight?
Boots is entitled to what he can negotiate. Boots is entitled to what the what the IBF, because that's where he's the mandatory, would tell him he's entitled to in a purse bid. So if he can negotiate more than what the purse bid figure is, great. If he can't, go to a purse bid. So it's not, to me, I don't get caught up in what you're entitled to. You're not entitled to shit. You're entitled to what you negotiate.
Mm. All right. So next, obviously, you broke the news of David Benavidez and Demetrius-Andrade, the fact that they're talking for a fall pay-per-view, and you also finally released to someone on Twitter the numbers for the Plant and Benavidez pay-per-view. That was something that we hadn't
I didn't even think that was
seen
that
that.
big of a. I didn't think that was that big of a deal. I kind of forgot about that when somebody asked me. I was like, you know what? And I'm not trying to be like a wise guy. Like I went back and I looked and I realized, you know what? I never actually wrote that because it wasn't like on the first of my
And
mind. It wasn't that
because
big
you
of a
never
deal.
wrote it, everyone assumed they were hiding those numbers because no one else revealed those numbers. Like, you're literally the first one till yesterday.
I didn't even realize that. But yeah, so that was like what 175 ish, 180 ish for that fight. I thought that's a pretty good number. I
That
mean,
is a good number.
people get so hung up on pay-per-view numbers. Like they see, okay, one, Spence and Crawford did like whatever it did, 600 plus 650, whatever the number was, and that fight did like 180, and you think, okay, that's a much better performance. And obviously, in terms of the raw number, it is. But what people don't understand, I think, and I hear and read from what people write all the time about that is the only thing that matters when you're doing a pay-per-view event, whether you're the boxer who's reaping a percentage of whatever the profits are, or you're the promoter that's doing the same thing, but also the one putting up the money, the taking the gamble. The only thing that matters is if it costs me $1 million to do the event, can I bring in over $1 million in revenue and profit? It's all math. That's all it is. So if you can do an event like Benavidez against Caleb Plant, where the purses are set, and you can draw that kind of figure on pay-per-view, you know what that's going to break down to. You know what you have in your gate. You know what you have in your sponsors, your international, your other ancillary revenue, such as T-shirts and all that kind of nonsense. And you've generated more than what it costs you to put on the event because there's obviously a lot of expenses. You got the undercard, you got any number of other expenses, hotels and flights and insurance, and we can list 1,000 different things. But that event probably came out quite profitable, and everybody did well. And then you get to a fight like uh, Crawford against Spence, sort of the same thing. You buy but much bigger numbers. So yeah, that was a good number. It doesn't make them pay-per-view stars, either of them, but it's a good start. And I would dare say that if David Benavidez and Caleb Plant, who had a lot of heat going into that fight because of all the back and forth, and they obviously, unfortunately, had the just a terrible bad blood between them as they called each other out in very vulgar language and all kinds of terrible things going into the fight, but it helps sell. Uh, Look, Andrade's a good talker. Uh, Benavidez is now more of an established guy because people bought that fight. It turned out to be a hell of a fight. It turned out to be a good card. Demetrius has always been sort of an underrated guy in terms of like his ability to market himself and to talk to the public. It doesn't hurt that you have a black American fighter against a Mexican American fighter. That always will engender not just some heat, but also they bring from different, as you mentioned, different demographics. So that can't hurt either. So I think that has a chance to be a successful event. I don't think it will do what Caleb Plant and David did, but I don't think it would be much less than what they did.
Mm.
And it would still be more than what Showtime could afford, budgetarily speaking, to put that on as a championship boxing event on Showtime.
Now, for me, having been watching the sport for a while, I prefer the Andre Benavidez over Morrell, but there was a lot of talk of Morrell Benavidez. Do you know what happened to that, or was that all just false?
No, it wasn't false. I wrote that, as a matter of fact. I broke that also, and I didn't break that using like unnamed sources. When I wrote the story about the possibility of David Benavidez fighting David Morrell, that was with on the record quotes from Samson Lukowicz, who is the promoter of David Benavidez. That was on the record comments from Leon Margulies from Warriors Boxing, who's one of the co-promoters of David Morrell, and they were trying to work that out. Now, my understanding of what happened was sort of like a combination of things. One, it was right around the time that Canelo signed with PBC, and I think both sides sort of were like, well, why are we going to do this and potentially risk the Golden Goose fight, which would be against Canelo? But there was also I won't say a disagreement, but maybe a lack of communication where Samson and David's father had agreed to do the fight, and David was kind of ticked off because nobody really clued him in on it, and he was sort of being, let's say, a little petulant. Let's say he just wasn't going to do it when he felt like they were not telling him what was happening, and in the end, they decided to go their different ways for the time being, and end up making this, or they haven't made it yet, but they're trying to do this fight now with Demetrius-Andrade, which is also a good fight, and frankly, I think a better fight from the standpoint of being able to sell the fight because I love David Morrell as a fighter, but he just does not have he hasn't been around long enough. People don't know him. I'm not saying that Andrade is some big megastar, but I feel like boxing fans are certainly much more familiar at the moment with what Demetrius has done over his career than what David Morrell has done in just less than 10 fights.
Absolutely, I feel he's more known to boxing
But that,
fans.
I mean, I'm down for either fight. You tell me, you want to tell me it's David Morrell against Andrade? I'm in. You want to tell me it's David Morrell against Benavidez? Wonderful. You want to tell me it's Benavidez against Andrade? I'm in. Any of those matchups, I think, would be a good fight, and it keeps the winner in a great position to potentially fight uh, Canelo if you beat Charlo, and even the loser of the fight. If it's a good fight, you don't throw them away. They can make a comeback. And now that they're all with PBC, because Andrade came into the fold for that fight he had in January on the Tank undercard, uh, it's now much easier to make those matchups. So I hope they get it done. It's a good fight.
Next is Clarissa Shields and her campaign to fight Keith Thurman. What is your stance on that?
My stance is I don't think there'll be any athletic commission in the country that would actually approve that fight. I could see it potentially with certain rules perhaps being approved as an exhibition kind of matchup where they had to wear different kind of gloves or perhaps headgear and that sort of thing. But there's no commission in this country, in my mind, that would approve that fight. So I understand where Klester's coming from. I think that she really believes she could beat a Keith Thurman. Uh, and all due respect to Clarissa, who I have ample respect for. I've known her since she was an amateur. I think she's a tremendous fighter. I will vote for her for the Hall of Fame someday when that hits the ballot. But she ain't beating a male fighter, in my opinion, especially somebody as accomplished and as good as Keith Thurman.
All right, we're on the same page. So, that being said, she did take to social media after Shadasia Green's performance and had a lot to say. Specifically, that asking her fans did they want her to move up to 68 and beat up Shadasia Green. Then they had their own back and forth. What's your thoughts on that matchup, and how soon can we get it?
Well, first of all, Clarissa has experience at 168 pounds. She was a unified champion in that weight class before she started moving down in weight. So she's certainly capable of handling the weight class. Second of all, I had heard a lot about Green, and I had not seen her fight yet until I watched her fight the other night on the Jake Paul card. And maybe she showed a lot of different things in her other fights, but I was really, I mean, I don't know her. I'm not knocking her. I just wasn't impressed. The performance that she put in compared to all the stuff I heard, I'm like, this is what they're saying all this great stuff about. So I was not impressed, to be honest with you. So that version of Green, I think would get run out of the ring by Clarissa Shields.
Oh, stab to the heart.
Are you?
My whole community's probably laughing at me right now. But yeah, because I've been following Green for 7 years. I've been talking about this girl for 7 years. Granted, her last performance, and I think people are downing her because she won every round. Like they're downing her because they expected a knockout because she knocks everyone out. Her last fight, she fought Setaroos, former champ. She knocked her out. Before that,
But there's no horror, there's no shame in losing a fight to Clarissa Shields, who's the number, in my opinion anyway, and I don't think I'm on an island when I say this. Clarissa Shields is the number one women's boxer in boxing right now, pound for pound. I don't think it's really even a close contest at this moment
no,
in
it
time.
isn't. It isn't. You're absolutely right. Clarissa, she's everything and she's accomplished everything. It's going to be very hard for any female to come behind her and do as much as she's done.
Yeah, so
But I want to
I
see
mean,
that fight.
what I'd like if she's going to get a chance to fight Clarissa, what I would like to see is Green go and do the. She's now mandatory because remember
To
the
Marshall.
yeah, the WBO ordered that fight. They gave her permission to do this interim fight because she hadn't fought for a while. So she's come through the matchup this past weekend. She won the fight on the Jake Paul card, and so now let the WBO make that official order, give them a deadline, make them make a deal or go to a purse bid, have Savannah Marshall defend that title against Green, and the winner of that fight could get either a Green versus Clarissa or a rematch between Clarissa and and Savannah Marshall at it's whatever weight class they determine. But I would think if you're Clarissa Shields, you'd have the opportunity to go up to super middleweight, back to that weight class where you had won titles in the past, but get a chance to become undisputed in a third weight class, which that carrot of that history would be a nice thing for any fighter. So that seems to me the logical plan. I doubt there's going to be any kind of Clarissa Shields versus Green fight until the Savannah Marshall fight goes through. She's not going to just go pick Green, who doesn't really bring anything to the table whatsoever. You know her. I now know her. But 99% of the people who follow boxing in any capacity don't know who she is.
No, you're absolutely right. And even for the Marshall fight, I interviewed Green the Sunday after her fight with Jake Paul on Saturday, and she said that after the first round, she adjusted. She wasn't
Mm-hmm.
used to seeing that many people fill up all the seats that early, and that scared me because I said, "What happens when you go to the UK and you got to fight Savannah Marshall? That's gonna be jam packed. Everyone's gonna root against you." So, yeah, these fights
You
in
know what? I'll
between,
tell you
she
something.
needs them.
Here's what happens sometimes. You get a fighter who gets a little bit of like a underground following. Maybe they're sort of like not that well known. They kind of become like this like they people sort of recognize the name, but they haven't really seen them, and so they become bigger than life just in people's imagination. I'm not saying that she's not a good fighter or anything like that. Don't get me wrong. What I'm saying is that because she had so much hype, it just didn't match with when you finally got to look at what she could do, in my opinion. So it's sort of like it's more interesting when it's sort of like you don't know what to expect and you're not really that familiar, but you hear all these things and you hear her backstory and maybe you saw a couple of highlights, on YouTube or on Twitter. But there's a difference between a highlight on YouTube or Twitter than watching a full 10-round fight and then comparing her to somebody like Claressa, where if you follow women's boxing, you've probably seen her fight many times and beat good quality opposition for the last several years, and there's a reason why she's number one. So they're always looking for somebody to make a rival for the established star, and I think that's what some people were thinking about when it comes to Green. Now, if she can go and beat Savannah Marshall and take that title, now maybe we got a real rivalry and a possible interesting fight. But until that happens, I mean, why in the world would Claressa even entertain the fight?
I agree. So Dan, we spoke about Shakur, but didn't say what's next now that Devin is moving up. I don't know what's sexier. I guess we should start with Devin and Regis because I interviewed Bill today. He slipped up and said it's a DAZN pay-per-view. Did you know that?
Well, I actually had inquired about that, and I was told that they hadn't made that decision. I think that for them to go pay-per-view with Haney versus Prograis is a sad commentary on DAZN, which started off as being the end of pay-per-view. Now, I totally understand when you have to take, if you're doing a Canelo fight, it just became untenable to not have them on pay-per-view. And to be honest, covering DAZN since its inception, my original feeling was there's no way they're going to be able to go through and put on significant fights and never do a pay-per-view. That just, to me, again, it comes back to math. I understand math, basic math anyway, and I knew that wasn't going to work. But if you can't do a Devin Haney versus Regis Prograis fight without a pay-per-view upcharge, why are you in the business? Like, that doesn't make sense. It's not that, I mean, don't get me wrong. It's a good fight. It's a really good fight. But it's not some $20 million mega gargantuan fight. And keep in mind also, by having Canelo depart from DAZN, where they're no longer putting up those $30 and $40 million
There should
guarantees,
be some money left in the
there should
budget.
be, I'm not saying 40 million, but you can't tell me you can't have taken at least a small percentage of that and stuck it in a rainy day account for the opportunity to put on a big fight. So, if DAZN is going to give me, misfit fights and, Jorge Linares against, the Jack Catterall kind of fights of the world, and that's my subscription for $250 a year or whatever I'm paying. And you're going to take a real fight like Haney and Regis and you're going to make that a pay-per-view. That's going to piss me off.
All right, so I'm going to screen share these rankings for you because as Haney takes that fight with Regis, he becomes champion in recess. Vasil has made it, I guess, a statement to Shakur that he's going to retire. So Shakur took to social media today saying, "Don't retire, fight me." Do you believe number 3, Isaac with PBC, would risk a fight for a vacant title with Shakur, or would he stick around and continue to wait for a tank fight? Same thing next would be William Zepeda with Golden Boy. Do they take the risk now that Ryan is lost and Virgil isn't really panning out because of,
Well, there's
where
a
do
lot
they
of
go?
possibilities. I mean, first of all, I'm not 100% convinced that Lomachenko's going to retire. If he's going to retire and he makes a retirement announcement, fair enough. I mean, see you in 3 years in the Boxing Hall of Fame. He's had a great career. But I'm not totally sold on that. And that would be obviously a really interesting fight for sure. As far as what would Isaac Cruz go that route? I mean, in the business, most of the time anyway, how much are you going to pay me? It's going to be worth my while to take that gamble. Because, I mean, nothing against Isaac Cruz, but I think I'm not going to stand here on an island and bullshit you and say Isaac Cruz against Shakur Stevenson's a competitive fight. I think that Isaac Cruz would get whitewashed by Shakur Stevenson. That's a 12-0 kind of fight in my mind. How much do you need to get paid to get blown out? And as far as William Zepeda, again, maybe not to the same degree as Isaac Cruz, but again, any of those fighters you mentioned, except maybe Lomachenko, who I would still make the underdog, Shakur is going to be a heavy favorite against all those guys. So the question becomes, how much does it take to get you in the ring? And keep in mind, by the way, whether it's Zepeda or it's Cruz or somebody else, If you go in the ring and you give a good effort and you lose to Shakur Stevenson, it doesn't ruin your career. You lost to one of the most talented boxers we've seen in a long time. Did it hurt Canelo Alvarez when he was a younger fighter and he went and he got played with by Floyd Mayweather? No. He made $10 million for that fight and went on to become the biggest star in the sport once Floyd was gone.
All right. So we got only two more.
Okay.
Joshua Helenius. Your thoughts? Obviously, now Helenius is filled in, common opponent with Wilder. Do you like it as a late minute replacement? I thought they would scrap it all together due to what happened with Andy. Why take the risk again?
Well, when I first heard that Dylan White was out because of the test, and they were trying to keep the show together, and they were looking for a new opponent. My first thought was, remember what happened the last time he got a replacement opponent to fight Anthony Joshua? Obviously, different scenario. He was coming here to the United States. He was still, had the heavyweight titles. Andy Ruiz obviously was a much more highly regarded fighter, even at that time, than Robert Helenius is at the moment. But I think all things considered, I'm very happy that they were able to keep this show alive. I always feel bad when these things happen and a whole show comes down because one thing happens to one fighter, particularly if it's the B side of the main event. All those other guys that have put in the training camp and spent money on their camps, and it impacts so many people who don't get to make their living. Whether it's the trainers, the managers, the fighters, you disappoint the fans who are looking for a good night out. So I think they did this in the right way. They got a credible opponent in Helenius. Yes, he's coming off. Not coming off because he fought last week, actually. But the fight that people thought about or saw, at least in the United States and probably in Britain also, was him getting waxed in the first round by Deontay Wilder. But Deontay Wilder's knocked a lot of good fighters out in the first round. So all things considered, the fact that they were able to get him in place, he agreed to a deal. He's coming off a win last week where he was able to, get in a couple of rounds, 3 rounds, I guess, didn't get injured. More significantly for the UK audience, because here in America and the rest of the world, it was never going to be a pay-per-view, just part of our regular DAZN subscription. But in the UK, they've taken it off of pay-per-view, and now it's just part of your regular DAZN subscription. So you're not paying anything extra if you get DAZN. So that's a good thing. So I think all in all, it's perfectly fine. And the other thing that's sort of interesting, everybody knows that if Joshua is the winner, that the likelihood is that come December/January, he's going to fight Wilder. For the fun of us fans, you can kind of compare a little bit. Like, he knocked him out in the first round. If Anthony Joshua, also knocks him out in the first round, okay. But if he struggles with him, or maybe he doesn't get him until later in the fight, or he goes the distance, it's a way for us to compare in a recent history the two fighters against the same opponent. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that will have anything to do when they fight each other, but it's something fun for us to sort of chew about over the next several days before the fight.
So the last topic is obviously Bradley's. Is that me or you?
I
Bradley's
think that's you. What
thoughts.
was the?
You want to jump back out and jump in, Dan? Just sounds like something is crossed there.
There we go. Now I got you.
All right. So it would be. Oh, he dropped off. All right. Hopefully we could get him back on. Because next we're going to talk the interview with Floyd, and then that whole interview with Floyd telling Earl to move up, and then we'll finish with Bradley thinking Crawford would beat Floyd if he comes back. Brandon, if you can double check before I start going to callers, if he will be able to come back. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to smash that thumbs up. It's going to help with the visibility of the show. It's also going to show Dan Rayfield do appreciate him coming on today's episode to talk some boxing with us and answering some of these, questions for us, letting us know how he thinks things will end up. It's unfortunate that not more people love the Tank fight, really. My follow-up question that I forgot was, because I remember I told him, I said, Dan, I listened to your show and I'm subscribed to your newsletter. And the reason I said that was to say, I heard you say Tank made 40. I heard you say Ryan made 30. I heard you say Crawford made over 20. So again, where are those men going to get that money from if they ain't fighting each other, right? Like that, you can't make that money. And I get it. no one wants to believe that Tank can do it because Tank hasn't done it yet. So it's like I say Tank fighting Crawford. Crawford looks so dominant. I sound like an idiot. That's what it looks like, but I get it. Dan, you there? Oh, you got to unmute. It says you have yourself muted, Dan. Yeah, it still says you have yourself muted. It says guest has muted themselves.
Is that better?
That's it. Got you. Got you.
There we go.
So
Sorry
did
about
you?
that. I don't know. I think that was your voice was going crazy. I'm not sure what was going on there.
Yeah. No worries. Appreciate you jumping back. Did you get to catch the Fight Hype interview with Floyd Mayweather? Oh shit.
We was talking about
Spence
Crawford should,
moving up.
yeah, Spence moving up. I saw like a little thing. I didn't see the interview, but I saw a quote that I don't know if I saw it on one of the websites on Boxing Scene or maybe I saw it on Twitter or something like that. Um, refresh my memory of what he said. He said that Errol should move up and fight at middleweight, not even at junior middleweight.
Yes, he said 160, 168.
I mean, that's Floyd's opinion. I mean, Floyd's opinion is as valid as anybody. Obviously, he's been
I think it's your Wi-Fi, Dan. You're breaking up. You're frozen.
making. I don't know what's going on there, my man.
All right, now you're back. Now you're back.
I think that Floyd 154, I think would be okay at that weight, and it's maybe I wouldn't jump all the way to 168. You got to pace yourself, I guess, when you move up like that.
So the other thing he said, which we touched on a little bit, but he had a different stance. He said he felt Devin Haney was being unfair to Shakur, and that he should have offered him a better offer than 25%, especially because he's a black man. Now, you've been doing this longer. I went and did the research. It looks like Mosley maybe got somewhere in the 20 percentile, not 25%. I couldn't find anyone that made 25% once you did the math of what he got and what the other got. Do you know anyone that got 25%? Because again, even McGregor, based off what he got and what Floyd got, that wasn't even 25%.
It's not even about Devin Haney offering him 25%. Have your people talk to his promoter and see if you can work out a deal. And it's not, I don't honestly, I'm so sick and tired of the percentage bullshit. Don't count the other guy's money. Come up with what you think you're worth in terms of the actual dollars. If you want to work for some upside, if it's a pay-per-view, fine. And be happy with what you can negotiate. And don't worry what the other guy makes. I don't worry about what you make, and you don't worry about what I make. I'm doing just fine. And I would say the same thing to the boxers. It all becomes a dick measuring contest. I want 26%. I want 27%. If you're going to go on a percentage, you know what the split is on a purse bid. The WBC has that split has that set out. That's a guide, and that's only if you can't make a deal. There's nothing that prevents Team Haney, Bill, the manager, because they don't have a promoter at the moment, from sitting down with Bob Arum, who he has a good relationship with from their time working together over the past few fights, and making a business deal. Whatever the percentage is, we'll pay you X. No, we want Y, and see what you can work out. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you I think this guy should make this much money on a percentage basis and vice versa. I'm not a fanager. I don't care what the percentages are. I deal in the facts. I deal in what purse bids are, what splits are, and what adults can sit down at a business table and decide. I'm not big into Twitter sphere of deciding, because he's my favorite fighter, he should get 5% more. I don't buy that. I don't deal with that.
And Tim Bradley and his thoughts on Mayweather and Terrence Crawford and the possible fight, and Crawford beating any version of Mayweather in Bradley's opinion. Does that matter? Is that more fantasy for you?
It is fantasy, although there was a period of time where Floyd and Tim were actually active at the same time. So the way I looked at it is the following. Floyd Mayweather stands at the top of the mountain, at least of our era, of the last, say, 20 years, let's say. Maybe that's more than one era. I go back as a kid watching Sugar Ray Leonard dominate his era. But if you were to take the type of performance that Terrence Crawford turned in against Errol Spence, and also look at all the other performances he's had since he's been at welterweight, where he stopped every one of his opponents and had been undisputed at 140, been a champion at 135, he made the case based on that type of victory that whoever the top welterweights you want to put in the conversation, you want to put in Ray Leonard, Floyd Mayweather, Manny Pacquiao, Oscar De La Hoya, Shane Mosley at his best at welterweight, Wilfred Benitez, Carlos Palomino, go back, Tommy Hearns, Roberto Duran, all the great welterweights that we've seen, in the last, 40 or 50 years. Terrence Crawford's in the conversation. He would hang with any of those guys. There's not one welterweight out there, from Floyd Mayweather to Sugar Ray Leonard, that I could sit here and in good conscience tell you, oh, I think that guy smokes Terrence Crawford. I think Terrence Crawford would win some of those fights. He might lose some of those fights, but he earned his way into the conversation, is the way I look at it. So if you sit here or Tim Bradley wants to tell me that he thinks that Terrence Crawford beats Mayweather, what am I going to argue with Tim Bradley? He's my guy. I mean, no, I mean, he's entitled to his opinion. And if somebody else tells me he thinks that Floyd Mayweather's skills are too much and he'd be able to outbox Terrence Crawford, I can't really argue with that either. I mean, it's a fantasy fight. It's not going to ever happen, and there's no right answer and there's no wrong answer. There's only about how you approach it. If somebody's not open-minded enough to think that both things can happen. Look, I took a lot of shit on social media, and because first of all, people misquote me all the time. I said the Vasily Lomachenko at his best at 130 pounds would compete with Floyd and give him a hell of a fight. And you'd have thought I called their mom a bad name, because I truly believe the Vasily Lomachenko at his top level at 130 pounds would absolutely compete with Floyd Mayweather. I never said he would beat him. I never said he would knock him out. I said it's a fight. And you know what? It is a fight, in my opinion. If you think different, fine. And the same goes for what your opinions or anybody's opinions might be about a possible fight between Mayweather and Terrence Crawford. But I know one thing. I've been doing this a long time, and the Terrence Crawford that I saw fight against Errol Spence would be in any fight you could think of in the welterweight division. And people whose background, guys who are in the Hall of Fame as promoters, as matchmakers, people I talk to who I respect a lot in this business, have said 100% they believe that Terrence Crawford would be in those types of fights and compete and win and maybe lose here and there. But point is, belongs in that group of guys.
Got a few questions here from the people. James Valdez, San Antonio, Texas. How does Canelo versus Charlo fight play out?
First of all, it's a really interesting fight. I would have preferred, I guess, to see him fight the 160 Charlo, but understandably, he hasn't fought for 2 years, so that's not happening. I would have preferred to see Canelo fight David Benavidez, if you ask me. That, to me, was the obvious fight. He's if Canelo is the undisputed champion, Benavidez, to me, is sort of like the undisputed number one contender. But we're not getting that at this moment. But the Charlo fight's an interesting fight. I mean, you have to favor Canelo because of just his experience level and also how good of a fighter he has been for so long. I do think Canelo, and while he's still a great fighter, is maybe not what he was when he was at his absolute peak. But Charlo has been inactive. Charlo's had his own problems outside the ring. And I'm not ready to necessarily make a pick on it, but I think that Canelo would win that fight.
David Maldonado, New York City. Who wins? Teofimo Lopez versus Tank Davis, and how?
Another great fight. I'd love to see it. To me, that's a matter of, can Tank Davis deliver the missile? If he can deliver the missile, he's going to win the fight by a knockout. If he can't connect, it's probably going to be a long night for him.
Lids Low in Decatur, Georgia. Who is actually willing to face Shakur Stevenson at 135? Is it Tank or is it Frank Martin?
Well, I think both of them would be willing. I think it always comes down to what's the business. I don't think anybody's running and unwilling to do the fight. They're all professionals. They all have confidence in their abilities. They all have egos. So I think that I don't view any of them as like a so-called ducker. I just think that the business has to be right.
James Benitez in Alabama. I read your articles all the time, and I'm a big fan of Fight Freaks. My question is, a lot of fighters hate reading the truth someone writes or says because it hurts. Can you name a time, or have you had a time, that lost access to a fighter? Was you ever able to repair that relationship? So I guess, have you ever lost access to a fighter because of something you said, and were you able to fix that relationship?
I mean, certainly over the time period I have done this, I've had my ups and downs with fighters occasionally because I do try to tell the truth. I do try to be realistic. I don't necessarily purposely try to hurt somebody's feelings, but I'm not afraid to give my opinion when asked, sometimes when I'm not asked. But I'll give you one example, and it's no longer an issue. And actually, we're friendly to this day, actually. We still text each other and check in with each other on a regular basis. I covered Bernard Hopkins for a very long time. From my first fight that I did of Bernard's, I want to say that I wrote about was when he fought Richard Hall. And first fight I covered of his in person was the first fight he had with Antoine Eccles. I think I covered something like, I want to say like 27 Bernard Hopkins fights at ringside and wrote about every single fight that he had from the time I started with that Richard Hall fight. And there was a period of time after he lost his mind, after he beat Tito Trinidad, where he threw over his trainer and he threw over his promoter, Lou DiBella, and he was, he didn't, he thought his shit don't stink, basically. And I wrote an article, and I was still writing at Boxing at USA Today at that point. I wrote a piece and was critical, and Bernard Hopkins did not speak to me for like 3.5 years. And as I joked with him after we finally made up and were cool again, I said, you know what, Bernard, I didn't care that you didn't speak to me because I was pissed at you too. I didn't want to talk to you either. We had a good laugh about it. Like he would go on conference calls or we'd be in a scrum and he would purposely like say terrible things about me on the call, knowing I'm listening in. You'd be in a scrum and he wouldn't even look at you in the eye because he would like look past you. And and it got to a point, he was getting ready to fight Oscar De La Hoya for their undisputed middleweight championship fight. And I was doing a cover story for USA Today. It was like a really big piece. And it was the first time since he wouldn't speak to me, I kind of needed to do an interview with him. I mean, I probably could have scraped by without it, but I kind of needed to do the interview. And his publicist at the time was Kelly Swanson, who a lot of the boxing media know. She does, her company handles all the PBC media relations these days and has for several years. And I was always friendly with Kelly, and I called her up and I explained to her what the issue was. And she set up a phone call where she basically moderated. It was me, Bernard, and Kelly on the phone. And we basically got all our shit out in the open, and we had a good conversation. And you know what? We made peace that night. We never had another problem as long as we've known each other. We don't always agree on anything, but I've become close to Bernard over these last several years. But that was a guy who for 3.5 years, wouldn't speak to me. Which again, I told him flat out, and this is the truth. I didn't give a shit because I didn't want to talk to him either. But it does happen sometimes, and you just have to live with it. I just know one thing: you have to be true to yourself. And you're responsible for your words. And if they hurt somebody's feelings, you don't do it on purpose, but you got to live with the consequences. That's how I've always approached it.
Yeah, man, I noticed Earl wouldn't shake Roy Jones' hand because he picks against them. So, it's like everyone gets it. What up, YouTube family? Don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Help us get to that 1 million subscribers. We're on the road to 1 million. And obviously, we have other great content on our Patreon channel. So since this video is over, head on over to our Patreon and check out all the exclusive content or right here on our YouTube members.